Наш сёлетні 5-й конгресс адбываецца ў год 70-годдзя са дня сканчэння Другой сусветнай вайны. Падзеі, якая нанесла глыбокую траўму тым народам, якія ад яе пацярпелі. І у тым ліку, у першую чаргу, народам усходняй Европы, палякам, беларусам, украінцам, габрэям. Народы, якія насялялі гэтыя крывавыя землі, якія сталі арэнай тотальнай вайны, тотальнага знішчэння. На жаль, гісторыя Другой сусветнай вайны у нашай краіне дагэтуль застаецца полем, дзе навуцы даводзілася саступаць прапагандзе. Пачынаючы з самага падставовага, мы дагэтуль не ведаем, колькі людзей страціла наша краіна у той вайне. У савецкі перыяд было прынята гаварыць пра кожнага чацвёртага. Апошнім дзесяцігоддзі мы з высокіх трыбун чуем ужо новую лічбу, кожны трэці. Хаця, здавалася б, давно была пара палічыць гэтых людзей, назваць іх пайменна. Это был бы найбольшы магчымы, найважнейшы помнік для тых ахвяраў і, можа быць, найбольшы зарок, каб гэта больш не паўтарылася. Тое, што гэта можа паўтарыцца, мы асабліва балюча адчулі у мінулым годзе, у гэтым годзе, калі под новай вялікай вайны адчуўся, прайшоў і зноў па тых самых землях, якія найбольш пацярпелі, па тых самых крывавых землях, якія найбольш пацярпелі ад першай Другой сусветнай вайны. Мы гэта адчулі не толькі па зводках з канфлікту, які баяліся мы, могуць быць уцягнутыя ўсе вялікія супердзяржавы, які можа перарасці ў паўнавартую вайну ўсіх супраць усіх. На жаль, самае страшнае было бачыць, як лёгка народы могуць ізноў трапляць у вір ненавісці. Як лёгка народы могуць паддавацца на прапаганду, якая, здавалася, засталася ў глыбокім мінулым. Мы ізноў бачылі і чулі дыскурс аб нацыях выраджэнцах, аб цывілізацыі, якая выраджаецца. І зноў цэлы народ, вялікі народ маляваўся у выглядзе недачалавекаў, якія недастойныя самастойнага існавання. І, не ведаю, большасці, не большасці, але дзесяткі мільёнаў людзей лёгка паддаваліся на гэтую прапаганду. Не толькі верылі ёй, але і пачыналі дзейнічаць так, як падказвала гэтая прапаганда. І часам у мяне, я ж таксама сын, унук тых людзей, якія прайшлі простую вайну, так, у мяне было ўражанне, што застаўся всяго адзін крок да поўнага паўтарэння таго вар'яцтва, якое здарылася тут, у Европе, 7 десятигоддзяў назад. Таму незразумелы выбар арганізатараў кангрэсу, якія запрасілі для першага дакладу даследчыка, які вывучае Холокост у Беларусі. Войтман Деорн, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this Congress for inviting me. It is wonderful to know that my book is being read in Belarus and by people other than a few grad students at university. So thank you very much. Before I get started, I would also like to thank our interpreters in the back. They have a very, very difficult job, and I'm going to try to make it not as difficult for them, but let's give them a hand. Thank you so much. As an American, I am saddened by how little my fellow countrymen know about the tragedy that befell Belarus during World War II. I hope that my book has been able to shed light on this important period for everyone by illustrating for the first time the deep role the German army had in the Holocaust in Belarus, in addition to its crimes against non-Jewish Belarusians. So I want to begin my remarks this morning with a story. It starts in the ghetto of Slonim, which was then Eastern Poland, in November of 1941. Rumors of an impending action had driven Hida Nussbaum and her two daughters, Lisa and Pola, to the ghetto fence, forcing them to flee. The two girls, 14 and 19, slipped through the fence and into the town. Shouts of the local children crying out, "Jews, Jews," you took off their yellow stars, drove them from the town into the woods. In the dark pine forest, they stumbled across the murder of between 8,000 and 10,000 Jews from Slonim, who were being shot into open pits. The two girls were were caught by a Polish forest ranger who pushed them back into line. But they fled across an open field. The German soldiers escorting the Slonim Jews did not shoot at them. Lisa and Pola collapsed in a barn and were taken in by a Christian woman. Pola, however, was shot in 1942 trying to escape the ghetto. But Lisa survived, frequently giving testimony, and became president of the Holocaust Memorial Foundation in Skokie, Illinois, in the United States. She died in 2002 on stage at a storytelling festival in the United States. In her last words, she said, "Please remember this story and tell it to others, because I don't know how long I will be here." The mass murder of Jews in the Soviet Union resulted in at least 1.5 million deaths before the extermination centers really became functional. For a variety of reasons, the story of this Holocaust, Lisa's Holocaust, has not been adequately told. I attempt in my book to add to our understanding of this Holocaust by bullets by looking at the complicity of the German army, the Wehrmacht. So, let's return to the Slonim killing site. This time after the shooting has stopped and the SS death squads have left. That night, soldier Franz L. climbed out of a truck at the killing site. Only a series of campfires built by the soldiers there pierced the darkness. His sergeant met Franz as he arrived. "Franz," he said, "it would be better if we just put a bullet in our heads now." Together they walked to the edge of one of 3 mass graves, where Sergeant R. explained that several thousand Jewish women, men, and children had been forced to strip naked and were shot. By the firelight, Franz saw piles of clothes and thousands of bodies. Soldier Carl M. also guarded the Slonim execution site and remembered that the scene was, quote, "terrible and ghastly to see. The air stank of blood and sweat." Suddenly, he heard a child's voice cry out several times for Mama. The voice, it sounded to him, quote, "sounded buried, crying out from the depths." Then all was quiet. Survivors began crawling out of the pits, startling the soldiers posted there. For other soldiers, their mission was not over until they had tracked the blood trails from the grave to find the escaped Jews, returned them to the pit, and ensured that they were shot again. This is what complicity looked like for the German army in the Holocaust. And this is what I wanted to look at in my research. For an astoundingly large number of people, the German army, or Wehrmacht, remains to a large degree unsullied by the crimes of the Third Reich. In the eyes of too many, the Wehrmacht fought a purely conventional war against overwhelming odds. Even more disturbing, the Wehrmacht is viewed with more than little admiration by some. Of course, in the historical community, we have known for a long time that the Wehrmacht was indeed, as one historian has termed it, Hitler's army. Scholars have written much about the allegiance of German generals to the regime and the commonality of aims that encouraged them to actively support Nazi policy. Thus, the complicity of the organization and its leaders has been well documented. What hasn't been documented is exactly what complicity looks like. It is a very vague word. So I was interested in exploring the shape of complicity on the ground. I found a series of 5 German judicial investigations that included Wehrmacht participation in killings in Belarus, and I began there. My research took me to multiple archives, survivor testimonies, and eventually to the killing sites themselves in Belarus. And this is one of them here in Novogruda. I found that looking at the behavior of these men on the ground can tell us a lot about the Holocaust, both in Belarus and in general. So I wrote my book to accomplish really 3 things. First, I wanted to show what the German army did to further the Nazi genocidal project. Secondly, I wanted to explain how it came to be so deeply complicit in this endeavor. And lastly, I wanted to explore the experience of the Holocaust at the local level, on the ground, where, as I suspected, it was far more complex than many accounts portrayed it. In particular, I wanted to examine the relationships between Germans and Jews. This also meant that I had to give a voice to the millions of Jews murdered one at a time by bullets before the extermination centers ever opened. So this morning I want to take a little time to discuss these issues in broad strokes. This is not something that is or has been widely acknowledged in Germany or the West, at least in the public. Instead, most Germans have been content to admit the general responsibility of the state and the specific responsibility of the SS, but have avoided applying this self-critical examination to their own families. This began at Nuremberg, where the SS was termed a criminal organization. This meant that simply being a member made one a criminal. The Wehrmacht, however, escaped this mass judgment, and only its senior leadership were deemed to be criminals. This makes sense. 17 million men, and not a few women, served in the German army during the war. That is a lot of brothers, fathers, sons, and uncles on whom to turn a critical eye. Moreover, viewed in the light of the Cold War, the German army had been fighting heroically to save Germany from Stalin, a point driven home by the very real mass rape of German women by conquering Red Army soldiers. I should note here that the U.S. itself was not innocent in this process. We brought over many German generals to learn from their experience fighting our allies turned enemies in the Soviet Union. A side effect of this was a stream of memoirs from German generals, which were conspicuously devoid of any mention of the role the military played in the Holocaust. And I show here just a few of the books that came out written by German generals. And the best example of this phenomenon is seen in von Manstein's memoirs entitled Lost Victories. Indeed, there are many who still view the German army as a relatively innocent organization. So I'm going to begin with my second question first. How did the German army become involved in the Holocaust in the first place? This is a question that must be answered at several levels, though I focus on the lowest of them in my book. We must first take a step back and look at what I call the larger Nazi genocidal project. Many people like to compare World War II on the Western Front with the war in the East by explaining the latter as some kind of barbaric aberration. I argue precisely the opposite. The war on the Eastern Front was exactly the kind of war the Nazis would have liked to fight everywhere. It was only due to diplomatic concerns and an idea of common racial heritage that the war in the West was at least somewhat more humane. Though I must say, that is of little comfort to the black French colonial troops massacred by the Germans during the invasion of France in 1940. In any case, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was far more than a military operation. It was the beginning of a clash of civilizations, of races, of cultures, at least in the eyes of the Nazis and many Germans. This was a war of annihilation, a war from which there would be no peace settlement, only the utter destruction of one side or the other. The Nazis drew on a rich history of anti-communist, anti-Slavic, anti-Semitic, and irredentist traditions to justify what was indeed nothing short of a massive project of lethal population engineering in which over 30 million people were projected to die as the Soviet Union's land was cleared in preparation for the German settlers who would take it over. There were also more utilitarian reasons behind the Wehrmacht's transition into a tool of genocide. And this was connected directly with a change in Nazi Jewish policy. The invasion of the Soviet Union and of Belarus saw the arrival of the Einsatzgruppen, which were units under the command of the SS, responsible for murdering Jewish men of military age and communist leadership behind the lines. But by mid-July, some had begun murdering men, women, and children. In this Holocaust by bullets, over 1.5 million Jews would be murdered. It may surprise you to learn that there were only 3,000 men in the 4 Einsatzgruppen that fanned out across the Soviet Union in the fall of 1941. They were barely able to handle their initial assigned task of killing Jewish men and communist leaders. When Himmler began directing that all Soviet Jews be murdered in the fall of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen were hopelessly undermanned. One consequence was the increasing involvement of the Wehrmacht, who had already been supporting the Einsatzgruppen logistically. Indeed, while the SS killing squads could be reasonably effective in larger cities and towns, they would never be able to cover the ground that the army was already covering. As such, a sort of division of labor developed, particularly in Belarus, in which the SS would murder Jews in ghettos and towns, and the army would round up and or murder those in the countryside. Of course, even before this, the Wehrmacht had been deeply involved in murder, which I will discuss in a minute. There is a final piece to this puzzle, something I call the Jew-Bolshevik partisan calculus. This is a quite simple equation. According to a long anti-Semitic tradition, Bolshevism was the product of Jews. And it was through this corrosive ideology that Jews were able to sap resources from the countries in which they lived as parasites. This was a particularly insidious and effective form of anti-Semitism for the Wehrmacht. And this propaganda leaflet here illustrates quite clearly the Jew-Bolshevik partisan calculus that I'm describing. Many of the members of the German army, both officer and enlisted, may have been ambivalent regarding the Jews, but they were almost all rabidly anti-communist. Indeed, they had been deeply scarred by the anarchy and violence that accompanied communist and right-wing struggles for power after World War I. To this already potent mixture, the war in the Soviet Union added the partisan, or guerrilla fighter. I should point out that a partisan movement as such did not exist until the summer of 1942 at the earliest. But the German army had a long history of an almost paranoid fear of civilian uprising. By making the claim that all Bolsheviks were partisans and all Jews were Bolsheviks, the Nazis could then add that all Jews were partisans, thus turning an entire group of people into military targets. One of the more startling things I discovered in the course of my research was a conference that took place in September 1941 in Mogilin. This Jew-Bolshevik partisan message was then explicitly passed on to the army. One of the speakers at this 3-day event was Arthur Neva, the commander of Einsatzgruppe B, who was currently presiding over the murder of the Jews of Belarus. The topic of his presentation, quote, "The Jewish question with particular consideration toward the anti-partisan movement. This is also the same man who had said in July that, quote, "A solution of the Jewish question during the war seems impossible in this area, Belarus, because of the tremendous number of Jews," end quote. On one of the conference days, the participants observed a sample anti-partisan operation which managed to catch 0 partisans, but to kill Jews instead. As the operational report read, quote, "Strangers to the village, in particular partisans, could not be found. Instead, the investigation of the population revealed 13 Jewish men, 27 Jewish women, and 11 Jewish children. Of these, 13 men and 19 women were executed with the help of the SD." End quote. The message was clear. Jews were to be murdered as a default when encountered by the army. A little over 2 weeks later, and a little over 2 weeks from now, soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the 691st Infantry Regiment received the order to murder all the Jews in their area. 3 company commanders received these orders, and each reacted differently. One complied immediately. The second hesitated, requested clarification, and carried out the killings in the end. The last commander, however, refused, saying that, quote, "My company would not shoot any Jews," end quote. This officer, First Lieutenant Josef Sibyl, told a German court that this order to murder the Jews was directly connected to the conference at Mogilev. He remembered that the subject of the training there was, quote, "primarily Jews and partisans." This is about as close to a smoking gun as historians are likely to get. But here we have a direct causal relationship between policy and action. And if you look at this graph here, you can see the incredible and almost exponential increase in the killing and capturing of civilians, mostly Jews, reported by one unit who had members at the conference. I want to shift gears here now to a discussion of what exactly complicity in the Holocaust looked like for the Wehrmacht on the ground. Typically, leaders of the Einsatzgruppen killing squads would make contact with the army unit responsible for a particular town. They would inform this officer of the pending action and coordinate for assistance. Let me be explicit here. The meaning of these operations was no mystery. In one instance, a lieutenant from the local army unit personally selected the killing site. And this is in the town of Krupka, which is east of Minsk. The Einsatzgruppen would inform this officer of the pending action and coordinate for assistance. In the early morning hours, the Wehrmacht would surround the village to prevent any escape. Soldiers would often assist in rounding up Jews from their homes and guarding them in a central location, while the SS accounted for all the victims. The army would then guard the Jews as they were marched to the killing sites, which were generally located outside of town. Wehrmacht vehicles were often used to transport the elderly and the infirm. At the killing site itself, ordinary soldiers also formed a smaller cordon to prevent any Jews from escaping in the last minutes. before they were shot. And finally, often the men joined the SS and local auxiliaries in the actual shooting itself. And I should note that these local auxiliaries were often Lithuanian and Belarusian nationalists who had signed up to collaborate with the Nazis. These operations were sometimes huge, as in Slonim, where between 8,000 and 10,000 Jews were killed in one day. They could also be quite small, with soldiers going on so-called Jew hunts, which killed a few people at a time. In any case, we can see that the Wehrmacht was certainly up to its neck in the crimes of the Third Reich. Yet, I was in some ways more disturbed by the discovery of other modes of participation. For example, looting by soldiers seems to have been widespread. One former soldier testified that he remembered his comrades had, quote, acted as grave robbers. They had taken 10 to 15 rings, watches, valuable pieces of clothing, end quote. Even more troubling was that they had sent these items home to their families from the local post office. Their commander led the way in this as well, sending a whole train car of looted property to his home in Bavaria. He even sent several of his own soldiers to guard the train car to make sure it arrived safely. I found this phenomenon to be particularly damning, given its absolutely voluntary nature. While we can imagine some element of duress at play in killing operations, there was no such force compelling soldiers to steal from the dead. In fact, this was often forbidden. Sometimes this theft took on a military context as well. This, for example, is an image of German soldiers going on an anti-partisan patrol in civilian clothes in the town of Krupki. I should note that this photo comes from the family of one of the German soldiers pictured here. When this soldier was interviewed by the German police in 1966, he stated that they went to a nearby village where the mayor took them to a locked building, which was formerly the synagogue. There, the soldiers picked their civilian clothing from piles stored in the local synagogue, which the Belarusian mayor referred to as, quote, Jewish rags, end quote. And these were, of course, the clothing taken from murdered Jews. Nor were there any orders for German soldiers to sexually exploit their Jewish victims. Indeed, there were orders forbidding precisely this. Yet the incidence of sexual relationships between soldiers and Jews appears to have been not insignificant. Imagine my surprise when coming across the following statement from a soldier describing the killing action in the town of Slonim. Quote, in the course of the morning, November 14th, I went into the town to see about my Jewish girlfriend, Ida, because I was afraid she had been caught up in the action. This was, however, not the case. End quote. This was a particularly maddening moment for me as an historian, because the detectives ignored this extraordinary statement and apparently moved on to what they thought were more important matters. I should note here, of course, that the word girlfriend, or Freundin in German, can only be seen as a euphemistic phrase. Sexual relationships almost always ran the gamut from instrumental relationships to violent rape, but they were almost never consensual. Consider the interesting case of Sergeant Major Eric Eichinger. He was 37 and was a low-level white-collar worker after the war. Eichinger served as a platoon leader and also worked in the Ortskommandantur, or military administration of Slonim. And here's an image of the military headquarters in 1941, and it is currently the police headquarters today in the same building. In his post-war testimony, Eichinger never mentions his relationship with Jewish women, but does admit escorting the Jews to the killing site and lingering to observe the murders. In what is certainly a remarkable situation, what we know about Eichinger comes from a Jewish survivor who remembered him by name 23 years later. Abraham Orlinsky was a 38-year-old engineer who had been born in Slonim. He had kept his occupation secret in order to avoid the first mass killings of intelligentsia. It is likely that he and his wife were permitted to retain their house because his wife was a doctor. The Jewish couple and the German sergeant major shared the kitchen. Immediately upon their arrival, the Wehrmacht had seized a room with a separate entrance in the Orlinsky's house at number 4 Kosciuszko Street. Eichinger occupied this room beginning in September of 1941. In his deposition, Orlinsky devotes much of his time to the behavior of his unlikely roommate. Eichinger apparently had at least 2 girlfriends while living on Kosciuszko Street. Both women were Jewish, and both lived with him in his room. His first companion is never named, but apparently fell ill sometime in October and was taken away. Eichinger then entered into a relationship with her friend, Regina, who had frequently visited him with his first companion and performed domestic duties. Regina also lived in the room with him. It is never made explicit what kind of arrangement was made between these women and Eichinger. But at a minimum, they received protection, shelter outside the ghetto, and likely more food, all of which improved their chances for survival. Eichinger frequently held get-togethers for members of the civil administration from the Gebietskommissariat with whom he worked. Regina served alcohol at these gatherings and overheard discussions of the upcoming November massacre of non-working Jews. She then warned Orlinsky, who initially suspected that she was trying to scare him out of the house so she and Eichinger could have the whole place. Regardless, he procured a work permit and survived. Sergeant Eichinger rose early on the morning of November 14th and left the apartment at 4 a.m. He returned to the house around 6 p.m., drunk and distraught. As Orlinsky remembered, quote, "He looked agitated and even cried," end quote. Eichinger had drank so much at the massacre that he had been cautioned to stop by the SS and had replied it was the only way he could watch. He went on to tell his Jewish housemate, Orlinsky, that he had wanted to save his first girlfriend, but that she had required that he save her mother as well. Eichinger said that he was unable to do this, and then had watched her killed in the pits, along with the between 8,000 and 10,000 other Jews from Slonim. Orlinsky remained silent while Eichinger unburdened himself, and then finally asked why the Germans had done this. Eichinger replied he believed that there would not be enough food for all the slaughtered Jews, and that Hitler had explained that no Jews could remain alive in Europe, and only those behind the Urals had a chance of surviving. It appears that Regina survived the November killing. And you can imagine just for a moment how bizarre this conversation must have been between the Jewish Orlinsky and the German soldier talking about the murder of all of his fellow citizens in the town. Like the looting, this kind of behavior seems to indicate a particularly appalling level of complicity in the victimization of Jews. It also shows the incredible complexity of looking at the Holocaust at ground level, where things most certainly were not black and white. Let me move on quickly to a discussion of motivation. Why do ordinary soldiers participate? One recurring finding of my research has been that the men tended to become more complicit over time, given more exposure to the Nazi genocidal project. Thus, a certain amount of normalization took place. Recall as well that this was a war where the laws of conflict, and indeed of civilization, had intentionally and explicitly been set aside. Soldiers were able to behave in the Wild East in ways that would not have been tolerated elsewhere. Anti-Semitism was also a decisive motivation for some. If most men were not virulent anti-Semites, which is my position, many of them were of the more polite variety, but also not well disturbed toward them. Certainly some men acted out of obedience to authority. I must note here that there has yet to be a single documented case of a German being executed for refusing to participate in the murder of Jews. However, militaries by definition operate based on discipline, and this certainly was important. It is also important to recognize that in these units, a group of usual suspects quickly developed, who could be counted on to volunteer for murderous actions, which relieved the rest of the men from confronting this case. While I found men refusing to shoot Jews, I found none refusing to guard them or march them. The effect of the Jew-Bolshevik partisan calculus should also be taken into account. Actions against Jews intentionally mirrored those against legitimate combatants. Moreover, the conflation of the Jews with the shadowy, frightening, and most illusionary enemy may have given some men enough justification. Of course, the insidious Nazi propaganda that tied Jews to communism was also very important. If the majority of Jews were not virulent anti-Semites, they were rabidly anti-communist. This is not to say that any of them could have really seen small children or the elderly as enemies. Such a mental construct may have allowed them to partially soothe guilty consciences. As others have concluded, peer pressure is the most mundane and most frightening of motivations. Many men killed simply because they could not bring themselves to step out of line. Some were overcome by the speed of events, while others acted to avoid being seen weak as comrades. However, there were a small few who acted differently, and I will conclude with this other side of the phenomenon. While the vast majority of soldiers were at best indifferent and at worst voluntarily complicit, there were a small number of men like Seville who refused to participate. They are vitally important to this picture, for they show us beyond a shadow of a doubt that refusal was possible without negative repercussion. Sabeel later recalled simply being judged as, quote, too soft. I think it is also worth mentioning a case of rescue in a bit of detail. A German soldier named Joachim Lochbihler had been a brewery engineer in Nuremberg before the war. When he arrived in the town of Lida, near Slonim, he was placed in charge of the local brewery to provide beer to the army. This brewery itself had been stolen from the Jewish Kupko family. Lochbihler, however, demonstrated a great deal of care for his workers. He allowed the Kupkos to continue working there. He took in families with children and the elderly, i.e. non-workers, and allowed them to celebrate the Seder. Most importantly, when the Nazis began to liquidate the Jewish population of Lida, Lochbihler protected his Jews from arrest. Jewish survivor Michael Stoll recalled Lochbihler saying, quote, "Michael, go into the house and wake everybody up and tell them to hide. Tonight we are killing off the ghetto. But don't worry, they're not going to touch you. I am standing guard. They cannot come into the brewery." End quote. Lochbihler and another soldier then put on their helmets and stood outside the brewery, turning away the SS squads sent to arrest their workers. One could chalk up his behavior to a self-serving desire to simply keep his operation running, except that Jewish survivors themselves remarked upon his humanity. One of the Kupkos described the brewery under Lochbihler as, quote, "an oasis." Yet, on the whole, such actions were statistically insignificant. At the same time, behavior such as Lochbihler's and Sabeel's is vital to our understanding of participation in the Holocaust. The fact that they were able to help and sometimes rescue Jews proves conclusively that such actions were possible and gives the lie to those claiming that their participation was driven by their fear for their own lives. Sadly, of course, as I have mentioned, most of those who refused shooting did not refuse participation in the operation as a whole. However, what I think my book and my research shows best is that German soldiers approached participation from a variety of perspectives and participated to varying degrees. However, as an organization, the German army was conditioned to become a tool in the Nazi genocidal project. In addition, the situation on the ground in the East was far more complex and nuanced than we imagined. What does this mean for our larger understanding of the Holocaust? I would suggest that it gives us a better picture of both the choices that individuals, both survivors and perpetrators, made in general, and some specifics into the unfolding of the Holocaust on the ground in the occupied Soviet Union, and particularly in Belarus. If Christopher Browning's policemen were ordinary men, I would argue that these men were even more ordinary. Certainly then, the behavior of these men is incredibly significant in our more general understanding of the Holocaust as a whole. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak here and for your time and attention.